In the mountains of western Virginia, where the fog dances between centenary pines and time itself seems to have stopped in 1920, there lies a place that America preferred to forget. Odd, a small rural community in the Appalachians, has become synonymous with a taboo absolute in modern society. Generations of marriages between direct relatives. Narrow and irregular, the dirt road leading to the Whitaker family property is flanked by rusty trailers and wooden houses that defy the laws of gravity. Kilometers before you arrive at the destination, GPS stops operating. It is as if technology itself refused to acknowledge this place's existence. In 2020, photographer and documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter ventured into these mountains with a camera and a question that haunted his mind. How can an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriages? A reality that challenges any fiction is what he found. The Whitaker family is not just an isolated case of consanguinity. They represent the extreme result of generations of geographical isolation, absolute poverty, and traditions perpetuated for over a century. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whitaker are brothers who carry in their bodies and minds the physical and mental marks of a genetic lineage closed in on itself. The eldest of the brothers, Ray, has severe physical malformations. His head is disproportionately small in relation to his body, a condition known as microcephaly. He communicates only through grunts and gestures, his intellectual capacity severely compromised. The only sister, Lorraine, has obvious facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent her from walking normally. Despite being able to speak some words, Timmy has a severe intellectual disability. His face carries the unmistakable marks of consanguinity, facial asymmetry, serious dental problems, and an empty look that reveals decades of social isolation. The youngest, Freddie, is the only one who can maintain basic conversations. But even he shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. What shocks most are not just the visible physical deformities, but the naturalness with which this family accepts their condition. For them, this is the only reality they have ever known. There are no mirrors in the house. There is no television showing other families. No references from the outside world allow them to understand how profoundly different they are. The house where they live is a heap of rooms without electric light, without running water, without any modern comfort. Each corner is impregnated with the smell of mold and abandonment. Piles of trash accumulated for years create mountains of debris in the backyard. It is impossible to determine where the garbage ends and what they consider personal belongings begins. Check now if you are subscribed to this channel, because this is one of the most extreme and documented stories of consanguinity ever recorded in the United States, and you will not find details like these anywhere else. To understand how the Whitaker family reached this point, a return to the 19th century is necessary, when the first settlers settled in the isolated mountains of western Virginia. Extreme geographical isolation has always characterized the Appalachian region. Entire communities formed in deep valleys separated by insurmountable mountains and kilometers of dense forest. The geography of this region is brutal and merciless. Mountains rising abruptly to over 1,200 meters in altitude create narrow, isolated valleys where small communities have developed their own culture, language, and traditions over generations. During the winter, snowfall can isolate these communities completely for consecutive months, forcing families to depend exclusively on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that when small groups are geographically isolated for generations, the genetic pool becomes progressively more limited. What happened in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founding populations, says Wells in his research published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 2018. Wells continues, explaining the concept of a population bottleneck. When a population is dramatically reduced and remains isolated, it loses available genetic diversity, creating a vicious cycle that eventually leads to mandatory consanguinity. The documented history of the Appalachians is full of similar examples. During the colonial era, whole families migrated to remote valleys seeking autonomy and isolation from the federal government. Many of these families brought with them ancient European traditions, including marriage practices already considered problematic at the time. The Whitaker family has its roots documented in the region since 1887, when John Whitaker settled in Odd with his wife Sarah. American census records show that in the second generation, marriages began to occur between first-degree cousins. The third generation saw marriages between siblings and half-sisters become a common practice, not by choice, but from an absolute lack of options. The archives of the local Methodist Church, preserved in Charleston's historic library, reveal disturbing details about how these unions were religiously formalized. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community between 1920 and 1945, kept meticulous records of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing his growing concern with the irregular unions he was forced to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today I performed the wedding of Mary Whittaker to her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 years old and already carries visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry is not much better. Both are children of a union between father and daughter. Divine blessing." These entries continue for years, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Morrison records at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives in the Whittaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his growing anguish, but also his sense of powerlessness in the face of a tradition perpetuated regardless of his approval. The isolation was not only geographical, it was cultural, religious, and economic. The Whittaker family belongs to a fundamentalist religious sect that sees the outer world as sinful and corrupt. Marrying outside the family was not only geographically impractical, it was considered a betrayal of family and religious values. This sect, known locally as the Church of the Elect, developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal documents found on the Whittaker property include manuscript sermons that interpret biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the purity of God's lineage. The genetic consequences began to appear in the fourth generation. Medical records at Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 Whittaker children were born with severe disabilities. 8 of them died before the age of 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in what geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which would usually remain inactive when a person marries someone genetically distant, become dominant when both parents carry the same genetic mutations. In the case of the Whittakers, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed that today's brothers have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355, meaning they are genetically closer than would be possible even among normal siblings born to the same parents. This indicates that their parents themselves were the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To put this number in perspective, Dr. Bamshad explains, a consanguinity coefficient of 0.375 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we see in the Whittakers suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of unions between very close relatives. This level of consanguinity results in what geneticists call extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the Whittaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios of human genetics. Martinez continues, what we see in the Whittakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly endogamic laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that it is a miracle they survived to adulthood. Their immune system, neurological development, bone structure, and cardiac function are all compromised by this extreme genetic burden. Detailed genetic tests revealed that the Whittaker brothers carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed simultaneously. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whittakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. The physical malformations are just the tip of the iceberg. Congenital heart problems, partial deafness, chronic kidney issues, and an extremely compromised immune system are part of these brothers' daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy with seizures that can last hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that make her constantly gasp as if she were always out of air. The most disturbing aspect is that these brothers represent the survivors. Local church documents indicate that at least 7 other siblings were stillborn or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. The 4 who survived are, paradoxically, the less severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have extinguished itself decades ago. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whittaker family cannot be understood only as an individual choice. It is the result of a complex system of isolation, poverty, and ignorance that has been self-perpetuating for over a century. Betty Whittaker, a distant cousin who managed to leave the community in the 1970s, offers a shocking account of how internal family dynamics worked. No one explained anything to anyone, she tells documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter. The girls got pregnant by their own brothers, fathers, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education. There was no knowledge about genetics. There were no alternatives. Betty, now 73 and living in a nursing home in Charleston, carries her own physical and emotional scars from life on the Whittaker property. She has deformities in her fingers and slight facial asymmetry, signs that she herself is a product of consanguinity, although to a much lesser degree than her current cousins. I was considered the normal one in the family, Betty remembers bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple sums, it gave me enough courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver picked me up to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that show how consanguinity was institutionalized within the family. There was a ceremony they called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl turned 14 years old. The family patriarch, in my time, old Thomas Whittaker, chose which male relative would be that girl's guardian. It did not matter if it was her father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians had exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty says that resisting this designation resulted in severe punishment, isolation in a dark basement, food deprivation, and in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. My younger sister Rebecca tried to escape 3 times, Betty remembers with tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to make sure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at the age of 23, giving birth to her 5th son. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not only tolerated but encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to maintain the purity of the lineage and ensure family properties were not divided with strangers. Old John always said that Whittaker blood was pure blood and that mixing with others was a sin. Raleigh County Social Assistance records, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whittaker children were recorded with the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own daughters or sisters. The legal system simply ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? Formal education never existed for the current Whittakers. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie never attended school. They do not know how to read, write, or do basic math. Their only source of knowledge about the world comes from conversations with equally isolated and ignorant relatives. For them, their condition is normal because it is the only reality they know. The most tragic aspect is that the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limitations, has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One of these relationships resulted in the birth of a child who died at 3 months of age due to severe heart malformations. The second resulted in a miscarriage in the 5th month of gestation. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches levels like those observed in the Whittaker family, the likelihood of birth defects and severe syndromes exceeds 50%.